Jason, thanks so much for joining me today.
No, thanks for having me on.
Hey, so I wanted to discuss this amazing book. Jason and I were a part of this really cool compilation called Lived Experience and the Search for Truth, Revisiting Catholic Sexual Morality. It's awesome. It's edited by Deborah Savage and Robert Fastigi, and there's some really great authors in there, including Jason, Carl Truman, Peter Colosi, a bunch of other cool people. So definitely take a look at this. I think it's so excellent, especially in regards to how do we live Catholic morality from the stance of our own experience, however broken that starting point may be. So, Jason, I want to get right into your chapter. I thought your chapter was excellent. It's called Reverent Curiosity: Why the Church Needs to Listen to Gender Dysphoria. So maybe before I go into my first question, how do you feel about the topic? Because I know when I first heard you years ago, when I went to a Steubenville conference in high school, you were talking more just about chastity in general. You know, how we as guys can just kick porn and start living as gift. But now you're kind of getting into a kind of a cultural landmine, but giving some good, I think, some good thinking in the area.
Yeah, pivoting a bit from sexuality is something we do to kind of sexuality is something that we are. And it's not, I mean, I'm still doing the chastity talks at high schools all over the place, but more and more I've met young people and families where this issue is just right at the surface and they're suffering and they're looking for answers and they don't know where to turn. And some of them don't understand what the church teaches. Some do, but they don't know how to articulate it. And I really wanted to not only give the research and the data from psychology and medicine, but really set the pastoral tone for how to speak into this extremely sensitive subject. And, you know, with that book that you just mentioned, one of the things I liked about the angle is looking at our lived experience instead of thinking, no, the people on the other side of this whole debate are the ones who care about your experience, but the church is just experience about, you know, focused on the dogma and the doctrine. And I like what Deborah was doing here of just bringing together a bunch of experts in their own respective fields of like, no, experience is not the antithesis of the church. If you enter deeply enough into the person's lived experience, you'll actually find what the church teaches, but you've just got to go below the surface quite a bit sometimes.
What I appreciate what you did in this chapter is you didn't forego the Catholic thinking. You didn't forego the doctrine, the clarity of doctrine. But what I heard you say and what I really appreciate about your ethos is doctrine isn't enough. You know, it's not enough just to sort of give us a document with 50 footnotes, but you're really advocating for a pastoral praxis. So maybe speak a little bit into that. Like how can we as Catholics, as Christians, develop pastoral praxis for persons struggling with sexual identity issues?
Yeah, well, the title of my chapter, Reverent Curiosity, you know, why the church needs to listen to gender dysphoria, might strike some people as a compromise of church teaching. Oh, here we go. We're letting dysphoria lead the way here. It's like, no, 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 no. What we're doing here is, okay, where's this coming from? And a bit of it I lifted from the ideas of Jay Stringer, who's an evangelical counselor and therapist. And he wrote a book called Unwanted, in which he focuses on people struggling with pornography addiction. And what he pointed out is that the church is really going about it all wrong. It just in terms of just sin management, just white knuckling it, getting sobriety and a streak away from that stuff. You know, but they pointed out like the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, it's human connection. And so we've got to look, you know, what are the deeper unmet needs behind this pornography addiction that might be driving this compulsion? And so if we're just simply counting days of how much we've got the streak going and just kind of just saying no to it, we're going to be almost like cutting the leaves off a weed instead of getting down into the root system. And we've got to disturb that in a good sense of just going down, okay, what is going on here? You know, what is it that I'm aching for that I think transitioning is going to afford me? And I think in particular of a high school boy I met in Texas, and he said he was trans, and we sat down, had a great conversation. I said, well, tell me about your life. And he said, oh, I got two older sisters, two younger sisters. And it's like, they can do no wrong. My parents love them. They fawn over them. They're affectionate to them. But I'm like the black sheep of the family. I got straight A's. I'm on the swim team, but nothing I do is ever good enough for my parents. And I said, well, do you think if you were born a girl, you would have been loved the way your sisters were loved? And he's like, well, I know that I would have been. And it's like, okay, well, here we go. Now we're listening to the dysphoria. And his ache isn't to go on puberty blockers. Like his ache is to be loved. And he sees a female identity as a pathway to that affirmation. Now, that's his story. Everybody's story is unique, but that's the key. The church needs more than a mouth. The church needs ears to kind of listen to these people's stories and accompany them and walk with them instead of just what you see on YouTube, watch this conservative speaker just crush and humiliate this trans activist in 2 minutes and 30 seconds. It's just clickbait. That doesn't work in real life when you actually love someone who wrestles with this. Like, let me just disprove your bad anthropology. Okay, you're all better. Aren't we good now? No, we're not good.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I think a lot of people are probably really intimidated by the topic in general. And so they're thinking,
Yeah.
well, how do I even approach this? So even what you've just presented by just be a listening ear to people. Like, what is that like? Thank you for sharing that with me. I mean, like simple things, right? Clothing the naked, just by simply affirming people revealing themselves, especially in these very sensitive areas of sexual identity. So I really appreciate that.
Many of them feel obviously invisible in the church. I mean, they could be sitting right next to you in the pew, and that dad sitting next to you just looks like a big old manly dad with his wife and kids. But little do you know that guy's been wrestling with gender dysphoria, since like adolescence, and marriage is a bit of a costume for him. But behind closed doors, he's really having some big wrestling. And if you're having coffee and donuts after mass, and you crack some joke about all this gender nonsense, he's likely to feel quite invisible. Like, man, if this is where the guys are at church, I better keep my little secret behind closed doors. And so we got to be real careful in the way that we're speaking about this. We might have a caricature of what we think people look like who might be wrestling with this, and have a bit more reverence towards the subject. And then, if God willing, that someone's able to share this with us, that the deepest ache of the human person is really to be seen and loved. And for those who feel completely invisible and erased, it's no wonder why that they struggle with high rates of suicidality and depression. And obviously, it's not because those transphobic religious bigots. It's because there's a lot of other issues going on beneath the surface, and more often than not, gender dysphoria is a symptom of these deeper psychological issues that simply aren't going to get resolved if they get ignored or they just get put on cross-sex hormones.
Yeah, that brings me to my second question I have for you. You wrote beautifully, and I quote, regardless of what may be influencing an individual's shift in identity, the question to ask is, what is my gender dysphoria telling me? So this brings to mind the current conversion therapy debates, which ultimately I think restrict access just to good therapeutic help for persons who are wanting to say, hey, I just want good talk therapy to talk about my conflict, whether that be same-sex attraction or gender dysphoria. So I really like the way you put this, because in other words, I was hearing our experience of same-sex attraction or gender dysphoria has meaning that needs mining therapeutically. And we should let people sort of have avenues. We should be pro-choice in this area, right? Therapeutic choice for a person saying, I just need some help. So can you speak a little bit into that?
Yeah, I mean, what a good phrase, meaning that needs mining. I mean, that hits the nail on the head. Unfortunately, so many therapists are afraid to speak into this because I think it's more than a dozen states right now. You can lose your license to practice if you're not just pushing gender affirmative care to see transitioning is the only solution to someone who has gender dysphoria. And so, what's needed is to really, where's this coming from? Let's talk through this thing, because sometimes it's not even gender dysphoria. I remember a college guy coming up to me after a talk, and he's like, "Yeah, I've really struggled with gender dysphoria since I was 7 or 8 years old." And I said, well, tell me a little bit. And we started talking. I'm like, you don't have gender dysphoria. And he's like, what? No, he's like, no, I do. And I said, no. I said, let me just try to play this out. I'm going to guess that when you were young, you felt drawn towards women, a bit mystified by them. You wanted to unravel the mystery of womanhood and unite to her. And, maybe you started wearing some undergarments that belonged to your sister, your mom, or whatever in private when no one was around. And there was a kind of a thrill. There was a sense of identification with womanhood, and an excitement of how risque this was. And when it went away, you tried it again. And by the time you got into adolescence and some sexual development, there turned to be some, more sexualization of this. And I said, what this is called is not gender dysphoria, it's autogynephilia, which is the love of oneself as a woman, of seeing yourself, of presenting yourself as a woman. It's not that you think you're one, but rather that you're aroused by the thought of yourself as one. And the guy's jaw just dropped. And he said, you just described my entire life in less than 5 minutes. He said, I always felt like the gender dysphoria label didn't fit on me because I never thought that I was a girl. I was just so perplexed by myself that I would even want to present as one in private. And in the milieu of this whole cultural transgender moment, I just kind of got swept up in the current and thought that that was my identity. And so very often, an entire story gets replaced with a label. And so let's peel the label, let's do a little mining, and then oftentimes you can get to the roots of what's really going on and then treat it with appropriate care.
Jason, that's brilliant, man. I think that's great. I mean, in our work, we deal with a lot of people who are struggling on various ends of the spectrum of sexual brokenness. I come out of a background of SSA, and I mean, I can't say enough how important the therapeutic was for me, and just kind of understanding what was the psychogenesis of my experience of SSA. And I mean, let's kind of go into that. I know that the catechism says, like the psychogenesis of homosexuality is largely unknown, but I don't think the catechism is saying then therefore you shouldn't go and search out your own psychogenesis of SSA. Yeah. I think it's just staying in its lane. It's not a psychological document, but it's saying we're not going to sort of broad categorize everyone's experience of SSA, but go and mine the meaning of what you're experiencing.
And I think there's a lot of pushback against this idea because many intuit the idea that, well, if you're looking into the origins of this, then you're just saying it was caused by some trauma or some bad relationship with my dad or this or that. And so you're invalidating my core identity by trying to treat it like there's some cause that made me this way, as opposed to, no, like, well, all of us are influenced by our environment, regardless of who you're sexually attracted to. And that influences our decisions and things like that. So the more we learn about ourselves, the better. I remember one saint was speaking into the topic of homosexuality, and he questioned a man, and he said, what is it that you see or you seek in that man that you do not find in yourself? And it's like, whoa, there was a one psychologist who said in the realm of human sexuality, the exotic becomes the erotic, meaning we're drawn to the otherness of the other. And if a person feels, in a sense, alienated from his own sense of masculinity, then manhood is the other to which he feels drawn. And so he's seeing in another something that he lacks in himself that's alien to himself because we're drawn towards the other. And so looking like, okay, is there a masculinity that I long to find in myself that I don't, that I feel would complete me by uniting to this person? Like, I mean, these are heavy questions. These are not easy to ask because, the level of self-honesty and reflection that it takes to be like, whoa, yeah, there's some hurt there. And let's just address the hurt for the sake of addressing the hurt, not for the sake of, okay, if you just go to counseling for 6 weeks, your attraction is going to change and you're going to think girls are more pretty than boys. Like, no. Let's be very careful not to make false promises that if you just do some digging here, everything's going to change. Sometimes it does, but we don't want to make those false promises because I think it'll lead to despair a lot of the time. Like, wait a minute, I did my therapy and the attractions aren't going away. Well, we can't promise from the outset that they will, but then we also need to be careful not to take a cookie cutter approach that like, oh, you experience this, must be that. I think the origins of human attraction are unique as the person themselves. And so we've got to take it on a very individualistic, perspective.
I really appreciate like the exotic becoming erotic. I do think that's Joseph Nicolosi, just a great thinker in regards to male homosexuality in general. I do think that there is such an allergy to these thinkers, these seminal thinkers, I think. They're sort of branded as coercive and abusive, but when you read them, they're just really thoughtful and really kind. There is something about extending kindness towards oneself. I read that through someone like a Joe Nicolosi. It's not a judgment. You made that really beautiful distinction in your writing. It's not about sort of condemning oneself. It's about showing compassion towards oneself in areas of disappointment or trauma or family of origin wounds, whatever the case might be.
Yeah, and I think that's why a lot of people want to kind of throw away the baby with the bathwater when it comes to Nicolosi's approach. It's like, oh, you just want to strap me in a chair and electrocute me anytime I have a thought about same-sex attractions and make that it's going to go away. Like, it's like, no, that's
it's really like who's doing that?
Yeah, like we're not doing. And so I think it's resisted precisely because it's so effective. And it's just like, whoa, what if this is spot on? What if this guy's intuitions regarding the origins of human attraction are accurate. Whoa, that reframes everything. Let's just villainize the guy, make a caricature of it, and make it just looks like he's some homophobic, wants to torture you to make your attractions go away. Because maybe there were some 1% of therapists who are total nut jobs trying to do that. That would just, yep, it's either that or just gay pride parades. So take your pick. It's like, that's a bit of a false dichotomy.
Yep, I agree with you. My wife comes out of an abuse background. I come out of SSA, and our healing journeys are obviously different. We have different symptoms, and but the ongoing process of chastity and integration, it necessitates reckoning with residual struggle, So I like what you said about adjusting expectations. Like, okay, once you go to this therapy, complete eradication of my disordered desire of whatever kind. It's like, well, no, that's crazy. But to say, well, hey, I'm healed and becoming more healed. I'm chaste and becoming more chaste as I go. And maybe I walk with a little bit of a limp, but Jesus helps me along the way, step by step.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, we've all got our scar tissue. I mean, it's not, I mean, that's the difficulty with issues like same-sex attractions or transgender inclinations. It's like, oh, those people, having those issues. And the rest of us Catholics, I mean, yeah, we got our issues, but it's not those issues. It's like, no. We're all just the walking wounded in one way or another. And as long as we kind of have this us them idea, I mean, why would they want to even come to the pews in the church? Because the idea that they get is like, well, why don't you take care of that little like dysphoria thing you're going through and then come on to church? It's like, okay, I'll see you and for my funeral. We've got to realize, no, come as you are. Even if you're at a point of your dysphoria where you really feel the need, you have to dress as the opposite sex, and you come to church, and you totally feel like everybody's staring at me because they can totally tell I'm not passing as this gender. Come on in. Sometimes I'll see women at church and their outfits. I'm like, what are you thinking wearing that to church? Or some guy wearing cargo shorts and a Peyton Manning jersey on Sunday morning mass. Like, part of me is like, what are you thinking? But then part of me is like, you know what? I wouldn't rather you be anywhere on earth, but right here at mass. I think the outfit, could use a little bit of refinement, but let's not harp on that on day one. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, not a prerequisite, maybe a byproduct of going deeper, but let's come on in.
Yeah.
This quote, you use this quote, this roadmap towards deeper healing. I really like that. You mentioned requires like a courage, almost like a heroism of people who are struggling in these areas to say, I want to go deeper. I want to trust Jesus. That takes a lot. And when I read that, it reminds me a lot of John Paul II, who I know is a huge patron of yours. But really his urging young people always to take the heroic way, to live in the gap of who I am and who I aspire to be, and not to fear sort of the hard, arduous way. Can you speak a little bit into maybe John Paul II's vision for sexual humanity in all of this?
Yeah, and then one of the things I loved about John Paul, is constant, be not afraid, be not afraid. I mean, the real fear isn't the unknown. The real fear is what we do know and just staying in that because we're afraid of the unknown. That's what we should be afraid of. I'm afraid of embarking. I'm afraid of risk. I'm afraid of going deeper. And so I'm just going to stay here because it's kind of a safe place because I'm in control of the variables. But at some point, we've got to realize that type of complacency is living out of a place of fear. And anytime we're basing our decisions out of fear, we're enslaved. John Paul's idea of freedom wasn't so much doing whatever the heck I want, but his idea of freedom was like, to the degree that anything is incapacitating me to love, it's to that extent that I'm not free. So whatever inhibits my ability to love, it restricts my freedom. And so in this instance, it isn't so much loving somebody else, it's like loving myself. Like, maybe the issue isn't so much I don't like my gender, as like I don't like myself. And it's like, okay, maybe I need to overcome that fear, kind of enter into that space and see why I have so much loathing towards myself, and that this idea of transitioning is going to afford me this opportunity. But with John Paul's basic ideas, I was just reading the other day, he's got a beautiful, beautiful meditation on Givenness that a lot of people have never discovered because it's buried on like page 890, whatever, of some theological journal.
It's a brilliant document.
But we were actually just given permission to turn it into a book. So we're going to be printing it for the first time in English. So I'm super excited about that. But it's this beautiful reflection on just human givenness. And I think something we can get from that, from the writings of John Paul, is that our sexuality as male and female is something given to us by God. And it might be a gift difficult to accept at times, but I think only by accepting it are we going to find authentic freedom. Not by thinking, okay, I just got to be free from this body and all these things, and then I'm going to be liberated. It's just going to lead to enslavement, not human flourishing. And so John Paul's vision of the human person is a beautiful one that's stamped into your body is the revelation that you're called to make a gift of yourself. But if a person's identifying as, for example, non-binary, what's the natural counterpart to non-binary? Nothing. There is no complementarity in it. And so John Paul's vision is a beautiful one, not really rooted in condemnation and shame and guilt. But I mean, I can understand where a person's coming from, because if you're going through gender dysphoria, there's other stuff on the radar, whether it's trauma, autism, all kinds of stuff that could be at play. But how do you fight autism? How do you make progress against OCD or major depressive disorder? It's like you're shadow boxing sometimes, wondering, am I covering any ground here? Whereas if the body can become kind of a false target of intervention, you can make progress. Like I could grow a beard, and I get a double mastectomy, and I could do this. Like, so you can actually see some progress towards a goal. Challenge is it's an endless set of false summits, and then you get to the end and realize the core issues were never really resolved because my body wasn't the problem to begin with. And so John Paul, and reminding us of the goodness of a body, is kind of pointing us back to the true way of healing, which is not living out of our fears.
Yeah, Jason, that meditation on Givenness was really pivotal for me, and understanding I needed to make peace with woman in order to become myself. And in my SSA, I was like, I'm kind of allergic to her. I'm threatened by her. Like, I want to sort of bypass her. And the Lord was like, whoa, that's a great starting place for healing. Like, why am I threatened by her? Why do I want to bypass her? So yeah, I can't underscore enough. A meditation on Givenness, such a beautiful invitation for all of us to be awed by the other. John Paul II uses that language there, to be awed by the other. In TOB, he says fascinated, become fascinated by the other.
Yeah.
So,
what did you discover on that quest of, like, why was I avoiding? Why was I fearful? Like, what insights did you gain from that revelation?
Yeah, well, I think it took me deeper into my own process. It really woke me up to the beauty of woman. And it's like, wow, I can, I don't want to treat woman like a gayish boyfriend. Like, I want to treat her as woman. I want to honor her. I have a capacity to honor every woman in my orbit, JP2 says in a meditation on Givenness. And I want to do that. And as I was doing that, it was like, wow, I'm starting to become like fascinated by her. I know that sounds a little esoteric, but it was very true. And then I fell in love with a woman. I met my wife. I was in Wadowice giving a Living Waters talk, of all places, kind of crazy. She's from Krakow. We got married, long story short. But yeah, I love John Paul. I think he gives us a vision. It's accompaniment with the direction of becoming what we are,
Yeah. And just for your listeners, Wadowice is where John Paul was born. So just for the graphical note for those who might know, in Poland.
It's not a weird town in Missouri, as some of you may be thinking. So my final question to you, Jason, is maybe just a little bit more about your work and how we can get plugged in to what you do. I know I had another one going into JP2, but you mentioned so beautifully his ethos, but maybe a little bit about the Chastity Project and how people can just get connected to you who really need help and maybe more information.
We've got a website, chastity.com, all kinds of resources there. We just published a book called Male, Female, Other, a Catholic Guide to Understanding Gender, and then just published right now a booklet version of it, Male, Female, Other, a Christian Guide to Understanding Gender. It's only about 80 pages long, so it's a real, quick summary of the church's teachings on this. You could give it to someone who experiences gender dysphoria, and I think they'd kind of feel loved and understood as well. So we've got lots of resources there, our Instagram, our YouTube, and we just came out with a whole course on the subject of gender at chastity.com/courses. And so it's like a 10-part class that's maybe 15 to 20 minutes per class, or we take like a really deep dive, like, is it possible to have a trans brain? What about sports and bathrooms? What about the history? Where did this all come from? So it's something educators, youth ministers could use, parents, or even a high school classroom. You just play it in front of a high school kids and then discuss the subject of gender. Because a lot of catechists don't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole because they're like, I've got a 15-year-old non-binary kid in my class and they're just going to freak out and get their parents all mad, so I'm just not even going to talk about it. We have to speak into it with compassion, because as St. Benedict, paraphrasing, he essentially said that the truth may hurt, but it will never harm. And so we've got to be able to present this in a loving way, even if it stings a little bit, as an antiseptic approach to some hurts that might be present in their life. But really not seeing as a debate I got to win, but a relationship that I need to build so I can walk with this person in truth and love. So just go to chastity.com. Instagram is just Jason Evert, Twitter, X, Facebook, just type in our name, you'll find us. And lots of stuff on YouTube. And the podcast Lust is Boring as well.
I'll link all of it in the show notes. Jason, thank you so much for joining us. What a gift to have you in the church doing what you're doing. Know of our prayers, and just a real honor to be with you today.
I appreciate it. You keep up the wonderful work too. Thanks so much.